In today's global landscape, food systems are under pressure from geopolitical disruptions, supply chain constraints, and rising demand. And yet, countries across the GCC region in the Middle East are working to ensure that food availability remains stable and resilient. This is being achieved through strategic logistics, diversified sourcing, and strong regulatory frameworks. Cold chain infrastructure in particular plays a critical role in ensuring that food is transported, stored, and delivered safely. At the same time, this is not just a public service. It is also a business, one that must remain financially sustainable for long-term resilience. I earlier spoke to Bobby Krishna, Senior Specialist at the Food Safety Department of Dubai Municipality in the UAE, and to Brent Melvin, the General Manager of RSA Cold Chain, which is a joint venture of RSA Global and Americold. Bobby is a microbiologist by qualification, whereas Brent is a cold chain logistics specialist. Here are excerpts from the interview.
Brent, you are a representative of a private sector end-to-end cold chain distribution hub. Could you comment on the stock in hand to ensure food security in the UAE and the broader GCC region?
Absolutely. So let me start off by talking about the general region. Is obviously been very focused on food safety for the longest time, knowing that we are sitting in a relatively volatile area, so not really immune to the potential of geopolitical fallout. And I've been here in this region for 21 years, and it has been the most amazing 21 years of safety and security. So this is an unprecedented situation, but typical to the region, they prepare, and more specifically UAE has prepared for this type of crisis. And I think a lot of this came about off the back end of COVID and other events where there's been panic and scare. And you'll note that the government's handled it in an incredibly positive way. So the first thing that happened is making sure food remains in the supermarket aisles. So there was no panic buying per se. The first day might have seen a little bit of a blip in that sense, but subsequently there's been continuity of product. You're not really seeing much dip in the way of brands or the availability of product on shelf. So that's testament to what is currently in the general supply at the moment. And then when you look at the country as a whole, we are covered for at least the next 3 to 6 months on general commodities and staples, even longer still. Now, that said, the whole thing about food safety is not necessarily what is only stored in country. And bearing in mind, you've got the private sector operators, of which we represent quite some brands who store with us on a 3PL basis. But you have the government that have their own policies and companies that would store and maintain food safety and security as a protocol. So actually the country is very well supplied. And further to that is not necessarily the amount of food in country, but it's the ability to start replenishing stock and how quickly can those supply chain channels be reinstated. And those would be key to the food security protocols overall. So, people immediately consider how much food is immediately available, but you need to look upstream of that. What comes through the supply chain, how quickly can they adapt to make sure those supply channels remain open or are reestablished? And then how quickly can that food start entering the market again so that you've got sustainability over long periods of time? So I think overall, the country has demonstrated exceptional resilience and ability to perform under what is a crisis period where everybody really practically just goes on business as usual. What a bizarre situation, but it's quite amazing.
So you're saying an ability to replenish, and that's a huge positive. That's a very strong framework that the country and the region has. But as an operator, as a 3PL operator, what challenges are you facing? And what are you doing to overcome them?
So the challenges for us would be twofold, and I'll speak very colloquially around we're a revenue-driven operation. We provide services to companies who are distributors or retailers of food products. We see channels of product going into hotels, restaurants, and catering. We see product going into retail sectors. So my challenge is twofold. One is being able to get product flowing in so we can continue to get product flowing out, making sure that all of those channels receive products on time, every time, in the way that it should be received. So concerns for us will always be maintaining supply, maintaining traceability of product, because if you look at what has happened just now, a lot of shipping lines, of course, refuse to enter the Straits of Hormuz for obvious reasons, but they can't just simply float around the ocean with containers full of product. They have to do something with it. So we've had containers on sea that have been redirected through different channels. Sometimes there would be a vessel doing a end of journey call, and they offload all of the containers. So you've got containers that end up in ports that were completely undesignated. You then have to recover those containers, get them back either its origin, so you can deal with the product and move it through different channels, or get it redirected to ports that are being serviced into the UAE. So traceability is critical. Going hand in hand with that is the time on the vessel. We need to make sure that product doesn't sit in containers for overdue length of time, because that increases risk. Containers obviously are chilled or frozen, so that is maintained and managed, but you want to ensure that we get product through the actual transit process, transportation into a facility like ours where we can take control of it, and then it gets stored in a suitable environment, a managed environment where it's process driven, it's well chilled or frozen, so you've got sustainability of the product for its shelf life or expiry date management protocols. And then from there is just getting it out to customers. So the challenge for us right now is very little downstream to delivery. It's more upstream to supply. And that's where we're suffering right now.
Mm-hmm. You spoke on traceability, and I'm going to come to you, Bobby, on that. I need your views on that as well. But Brent, what cold chain intervention measures do you believe will ensure resilience?
We are automatically part of a very big food chain network. And I think that, you talk about resilience comes from policies driven by government. It comes from how companies plan and support their supply chains. So a typical thing that we've always done, and when I say we, I'm talking the logistics industry at large, is use the UAE as a hub for local consumption as well as re-export to our environment, which would be GCC or maybe neighboring countries. Depending on the company and the way that they do distribution is how they hold stock in country. So we try and provide two things. One is the ability to put stock in a forward stocking location to make sure you've got continuity. So you can imagine in this crisis, it's about who has stock in country is going to put stock on shelf, which is a sales potential, amongst other things. Now, when we're looking then at resilience, in order to build out those kind of requirements, you need to have exceptional facilities. These exceptional facilities are part of not only the physical processes, but equally the data processes that support them. So visibility of cargo, visibility of your expiry life cycles, sustainability of your cold chain to make sure that we're not seeing any kind of temperature excursions during the process of storage or logistics support. So those are key for us. And this goes hand in hand with what regulations exist around food safety. So UAE Federal Law number 10 of 2015 creates a legal framework for food safety. We operate within that governance and we are audited according to those protocols and make sure that that's how we create a very strong cold chain network for our customers, and that helps create resilience in the food chain.
Bobby, would you like to comment on this, on cold chain intervention measures?
Yeah, Surendar, I think when you look at the cold chain and interventions, and we like to see the products in different categories, frozen versus chilled, and also fresh produce versus meat, poultry products. The biggest difference here is that when we look at fresh produce, there are limitations as to how long you can hold versus meat and poultry products, where if you are bringing in something chilled, you can make it frozen and extend the shelf life further, right? So the challenge is always associated with produce, and we also want people to eat healthy. No, it's just not like you get more proteins. There's a whole population that has vegetables and fruits as their core diet. So we looked at the different food supplies, did a risk assessment, and kind of looked at all the options to ensure that those products move faster and also separately. And we've seen that the controls that the industry has, as Brent was mentioning, especially with frozen chilled products, are pretty good because they are high value products, and they've always been on the best of conditions. And we also have a premium market for these products, so there's a lot of investments already in place. And when it comes to cold chain integrity, traceability tools are always available. Products, temperature monitoring, and also product monitoring records are always there. And our investments in digitalization since almost more than 2 decades has also helped us always, because you can trace back any products, you can find documents from anywhere, access them without any hassles. As long as there is power supply, we don't have a challenge, right? When it comes to fresh produce, it's a whole different supply chain. We've seen disruptions, and that's one reason why you saw waves in the supermarket, and that's largely because it cannot be stored. For instance, take the example of banana coming in from Ecuador. Large ships have to come into the ports. They may not be able to come in directly dock into Jebel Ali. They have to go to other ports in other countries, then take them off into smaller ships and bring it to UAE's ports. And there is a particular shelf life that these products would have if there is a deviation in the temperature, right? It cannot be like frozen or even a 2 degrees centigrade difference can enhance ripening of fruits and vegetables. So that's where the challenge is. So I think we've seen very good response. Retailers have really kept that in control. They've diversified the sources. So we've seen suddenly that we're not depending on one country. The businesses have gone for multiple options, and then supplies have been replenished. So the agility that you have comes from the experience of the traders and retailers, and that's very, very clearly visible. And as Brent rightly pointed out, during COVID, we have seen supply chain problems, and we also see ripple effects, right? So you see one set of problems, and that's in your first wave, which is suddenly shortage of supplies, and the second wave is very different, and there you see supplies getting steady, but number of products might go down. But consumers also got used to those products, and we also saw retailers, having a very different demand right now. Hotels and tourists have gone down, so that consumption pattern has changed completely. I think choice of people also have changed. So the way we eat today is very different from how it was 1 month ago. So that food choice kind of also impacts, and it's like a two-way communication without saying. Like business and consumers are communicating by just showing by demand what are they buying more is what is getting supplied. That's the second factor, and then you have the third wave, which are coming as impacts of supply chain disruptions in the countries that they produce, right? So you might have changes in energy is a major problem. So you look at Southeast Asia now, there will be impact. India is heavily impacted by the shortage of supply of LPG. So you can also see that affecting farms and input. We've also seen reduction in fertilizer production or supply, and that also will cost, they increase the cost and lower the productivity in countries. So that wave is slightly different, and so we are prepared for all these things at different that can happen at different times, right? So, and communication is the key. So engaging the businesses as much as possible is what we're trying to do. So we know the problems, we know they're likely to happen, but how far and to what extent is what we don't know, and that's normally done through communication.
Okay, thanks. Brent, now that the region is seeing war clouds, are any efforts underway to increase cold storage capacity in the GCC region in terms of more pallets and basically more cold storage facilities?
I wouldn't say that the current geopolitical situation is a driver of cold store development. I think the region has had some years of new facilities coming on stream or additional capacity coming on stream. So, there tends to have been a market that in any event is growing. As a result, there is this continued investment in cold storage. To your question, will this drive the additional requirement? I think that's hard to answer directly. What I will say is that in times like this, demand is scarce because a lot of people end up with two things happening. One is re-exporters are limited to the ability to re-export currently, and that's due to the availability of vessels or for the outbound export volumes. And that volume would have been sitting in port. It can't just sit in port for long periods of time. There are costs associated with that. So what happens is it then gets pulled back into facilities like ours. So storage becomes an absolute requirement. The other thing we're seeing, which is something similar to what happened during COVID, or in fact, actually more so what happened in the Red Sea crisis, is the redirection of vessels to longer sailing. So when vessels did come through, you'd get this concertina effect and suddenly a lot of port congestion going on. And when you get ports congestion being cleared, you get this big influx of containers happening all at once. So we're seeing a similar trend where, exactly as Bobby was describing, mother vessels will call in Mundra or Navashiva. They will offload a huge amount of volume in those ports, and then you've got feeder vessels bringing products into either Corfacam, Sohar, or in some cases Dukam. So you've got your green channel that's coming out of Oman, and you've got your clearance coming through Corfacam directly into country. Initially, as these ports arrangements were established, the flow was more idea and in principle workable. In practice, not so much. They had to iron out a few smaller details. You've seen huge queues of trucks waiting to collect containers in the port. The demand for gensets to move reefer containers and maintain cold chain has been unbelievable. So anybody who's sitting on a genset trailer at the moment is a prime supplier. But as these complexities are ironing out and the government is adjusting to the documentation processes, to the flow of goods, what you're seeing is suddenly this bigger release of volume. So my contract customers who traditionally would store with me would have had a steady inflow of containers throughout a period of time, because equally they'd be selling to market or reselling to different countries. So we'd see an inbound outbound flow continuously. What we've seen for the last number of weeks is this outbound flow going obviously into local market consumption, but without the inbound. That's been the concertina. Now all of a sudden we're getting this massive release of containers hitting us all at once. So it's putting pressure on the supply chain and it's putting pressure on capacity. So myself, competitors in the market, people who are in the space will be not only managing their own customers, but the amount of new customers that are looking for space who typically wouldn't have used facilities like ours. So to your point now, yes, capacity is important. But what happens after this would be another story altogether. So touching on what Bobby mentioned about HoReCa, so hotels, restaurants, are driven largely by tourism. Because tourism is going to be affected for the time being. the impact on consumption in local markets is naturally decreased. So I deal in about 200 tons of fresh produce every single day as a stock throughput. And Bobby's right, it's a different style of operations as opposed to your chilled or your freezer volumes. And because of that velocity, a lot of that goes into HVAC. We're seeing that being impeded somewhat as far as consumption, just simply because those channels are not tuning up that were. Dubai, UAE will bounce back. They'll do whatever promotions they do. They'll bring tourism back as quickly as possible, but it is a point in time. And this means that right now there's pressure on the cold chain, but it's not going to necessarily be sustainable because we will normalize. There is continued investment in the sector. There's continued enhancement in facilities. The issue you've got right now would be probably facilities that are not necessarily A grade will be full of product because they need to store it somewhere. That will be a concern, particularly for people like Bobby, because if those facilities are not suitable to maintaining product quality and integrity, what's the fallout from there? So that would be more my concern than what the current capacity is for modern facilities. There are many modern suppliers of really quality facilities in country already.
Okay. Well, Bobby, you want to jump in on what Brent said?
Spot on there, Surendar, kind of echoing on the food safety aspects here. It is always a challenge to look at the interim arrangements that are being made because we don't even know where those arrangements are. So what happens if a supply is out of the port and there's a generator failure or a lack of cooling? Your product can look completely perfect, come to the port, and things are different from how it reaches the market. And I think that's exactly where we have to have that confidence on the importers that products will not be compromised, and if there is a deviation, they have to let us know, and then we look at what can you do with those products. Can reduction of shelf life or reprocessing, whatever we could do is what we'll try, and that's why these risk assessment processes are very important. So we've created different flowcharts and process plans for decision making. There's a decision tree for each of these scenarios that we've created, and that has been shared with the team, so we can quickly move on and take decisions. So what happens if frozen poultry comes in and it gets defrosted? Or a great example is shell eggs. Currently, as Brent mentioned, there's a whole delay in reaching the ports, and by the time it reaches the port, it's close to the end of its shelf life. So what can you do with it? Can you process it quickly or repurpose it? So those kind of challenges would always be there. And then also we have to look at legislations. We've been traditionally using best before and expiration dates interchangeably, whereas Europe and US best before dates would mean that you can use the product even after that time period is over. So we're also looking at flexibility in date marking, looking at shelf-stable products, perishable products, and trying to be agile with our legislation management. So there have been regulations which are set specifically for the interim period, which gives more flexibility. There's always a risk trade-off. You don't have those ideal conditions to protect public health to the level that you would want to. So by making the regulations slightly less stringent doesn't mean that you will have adverse. It's just that it increases slightly the probability of food going off, especially in this case quality, not safety, with the best before dates. So those are the kind of measures that we are focusing on at this moment.
Bobby, Brent spoke earlier on food traceability, and I read an article that you posted recently where you said that food traceability is not going to be easy when supply chain complexity increases. And I believe you said this in response to news reports on how large supermarket chains in the UAE are looking to freight food on boat and or road into the country's supply chain. Would you like to substantiate?
So there are two aspects here, sir. They're like, supermarkets might have better control most of the products that they would come in, provided the supply chain. I mean, it all depends on how the weakest link on the supply chain. Yeah? So most importers would have a good control, good visibility, especially if it's coming from Europe. There are certain trade routes, and documents have to go along with it, right? So you cannot forge a health certificate and get some products. But what happens is that when it comes to a manufacturing facility which uses 50, 60 different products to make an ice cream, it's difficult to know what came from where, with what ingredients, and so on, because they still need to carry that to the labels that they will use for manufacturing, right? So a retailer might be able to do that, but a manufacturer would have a challenge in identifying the products and their origins. And there also comes a vulnerability for food fraud, right? So you have traceability mechanisms strengthened mainly to reduce food fraud, in making sure that what we say is what we are giving, right? That's where the challenge is going to be, and this could be intentional or non-intentional, right? In some cases, intentional. And when we look at the past, and when Ukraine-Russia war started, there was a huge crisis with many food products. Wheat was down, eggs were down. Ukraine is one of the biggest suppliers of poultry products. And then for that, so when there is a deficit, other markets come and push in. So I'm not naming the countries, but there were products that came in from different countries with the Ukrainian label into the market, and those kind of frauds will happen. So there would be claims on origin. So origin fraud is a very common aspect, and this could happen to any product, right? There is a deficit where you cannot really identify. I mean, it's very hard for someone to judge the difference between an egg from A country versus B country, right? So then some products like Apple, you might be able to get it from taste or look or color, but not in poultry, especially like products like eggs. So that's where I was looking at the traceability. And it can also get really complex when it comes to certain ingredients, and the fraud increases. Like, for instance, pistachios were really short, and Dubai chocolate fame increased the pressure on both pistachio and chocolate. And we can only anticipate those frauds to go up further, because there will be a further increase in demand, and not necessarily from the current market, but it also feeds into the supply chains later, because manufacturers don't produce food for this month. They are producing food for the next 2-3 years, right? So, and then again, this is a category that I would deal with separately. Retailers will finish off by the time the product comes to the shelf, that's done. Whereas manufacturers have to get in products, produce it, and then put it to the shelf or dispatch it to other countries. And they have pressure on both sides, right? They have pressure on incoming and outgoing, and they need to make sure that the flow is on either side.
As a government representative, are you seeing a shift in any of the policies that have been in place for a while now? Any change in enforcement measures in response to the war situation, of course?
I think an important aspect of legislation, especially in Dubai, is that it's always built to absorb the pressures that would come in. So if you read the food code, it specifically says that there would be exceptional situations where you will have to use the risk logic and take decisions based on risk. And businesses are trained to understand risk and manage risk, and not to take absolute values as control measures. It's not the 5 degrees centigrade, it's 5 degrees centigrade for how long, and where and who is controlled. And emphasis has always been on management controls more than anything else. So legislations also allow better businesses to have more allowances and take better decisions with flexibility, whereas businesses that do not have a good compliance rating would have more or less flexibility in taking decisions. That's what we're continuing with. So even in today's context, that's what we are emphasizing with the team. Businesses that are compliant better will get better benefits, and their labeling requirements have been made less stringent. English labeling versus Arabic labeling. So for instance, some products you may not have Arabic labels printed because of the shortage in time to get to the market. So English label would be okay. Shelf life decisions, as I mentioned earlier, we are giving flexibility with shelf life, especially for frozen and dry goods. We're also giving documentation processes some allowance. So every product that comes into the country has to come with health certificates and documents which have to be given in. The originals have to be submitted. So now we're giving more allowance to get the original documents. Soft copies and messages would be enough to kind of release those. So there are allowances made, but that's not breach of requirements or change of requirement. It's just that there is a time. There's a bit of flexibility given on submission deadlines so that businesses can they don't have to worry about the documentation per se.
Mm-hmm. So a bit of flexibility, a bit of agility on that, I suppose, right? And okay. Brent, yes, you want to jump in?
Just want to pick up on the whole expiry thing. So you've got the regulatory side of it, which Bobby has just described. But actually, interestingly enough, you have a consumer self-governance that takes place, which people wouldn't necessarily see. But if you look at retail outlets that we deliver to, they have what they refer to as a minimum shelf life requirement. So automatically, it doesn't matter if your product is still within a usable expiry period, it will not be received by certain retailers. And most of your mainstream high-end retailers have very strict shelf life requirements. So I'll pick up on something like meat, and meat comes into our country in one of two ways. It either comes in frozen or it comes in fresh. So just from a fresh perspective, there are limitations to your sailing period because you don't have the extended shelf life capabilities when it's fresh. So we would have situations where it'll arrive in port. It's getting near expiry. It doesn't mean to say it can't enter and it doesn't meet the regulatory requirements. But from a commercial standpoint, it won't move into the food chain for most retail sectors. So you get a lot of containers that get sold direct from port that are picked up by hotels. And again, depending on the hotel, catering because it's cooked prior to an expiry date, but it can be closer to expiry. So we have an entire ecosystem that will touch the product at different stages of its life cycle. But from a commercial standpoint, there's a massive benefit by having delays on ocean. So, it doesn't necessarily only relate to regulatory import controls, but the actual consumer places its own controls around and self-governance around expiry of product.
Okay.
There is a value proposition also, Surendar. So a product might get frozen during the transit to enhance shelf life, right? So you can increase the shelf life of meat by freezing it instead of holding it chilled. So now the value changes because frozen meat is seen as less as you get less value in the market. So yes, that's the bargain that you would have normally. Someone is losing money because of that process, but then food is still safe. So the answer is that you might have food, but the concern would be at what cost is it coming in and who is losing, etc. And that's the trade-off that someone is going to make along the supply chain. So I think we have to also look at two different aspects here. One is the economic aspects of the war and conflict and how it impacts trade versus the food security aspect. And at some point of time, they're going to merge because lesser money would mean lesser investments. Now, imagine companies have to invest in generators, for instance, or buy machines and stuff like that. There's a cost that's going to go there. Producers have to put more money for fertilizer and for fuel. There's another set of costs. So that's the inflationary pressure that would set in. And that's what we have to be ready for now, which are things which will happen after 6 months or 1 year, and that brace ourselves with better policies for those decisions. And that's our future foresight plans and so on puts into, that's what we need to put into action.
So that was the interview I had with Bobby Krishna of Dubai Municipality and Brent Melvin of RSA Cold Chain.